What is an unconscious bias? How do I know I have them? How do I get rid of them? What is the bias? What if the bias is not unconscious? How may my actions impact others if I hold unconscious biases? Who is most impacted by unconscious bias? And what can I do to ensure I am aware of my unconscious bias? And one of the most important questions is, what are the implications for my practice as someone who will be helping others and engaging with others? So, those are some initial questions I just wanted to start with before I do anything else. As we think about unconscious bias as such a popular topic, especially of late, but think to center that topic into understanding about our practice and how this implicates others and impact others. So I want to just take a minute right now just to say I'm happy to be your guest speaker. My name is Dr. Andrew B. Campbell, aka DR.ABC. You can call me Andrew. Andrew is fine. And I'm happy to be here to be your guest presenter in this course, Counseling Gender and Diversity, as we think about unconscious biases and dealing with them and how to make sure we are aware. And the picture I chose to I choose to use a picture that on the slide that focuses on the brain, and just to give you that first initial idea that unconscious bias happens automatically. It happens automatically. It comes from what we call our schema, our past experiences, and how those impact how we see things, how we relate to things, how we approach things, how we value things, how we see things, especially when you think about diversity, inclusion, equity, and the impact of unconscious bias in those areas. So I'm really happy to be a part of the process of your own growth, learning, and unlearning. And those are some powerful words that I like to use: growth, learning, and unlearning, because that is what education is about. It's more than about getting an A plus for a paper. It's about the learning and the unlearning that we need to do. And something, when you think about unconscious bias, we'll realize that a lot of dealing with unconscious bias will require a lot of unlearning. So that is why I mentioned unlearning so early in the process, because a lot of our biases come from what we were taught, how we were wired, how we were brought up, what influenced how we see people. Sometimes we say to somebody, how do your first idea of what a LGBTQ person is, or a gay person, or a black person, or a homeless person, or an immigrant? Those initial learning ideas, we hold them, we learn them, and we hold them, and we grasp them from some of our past schema, and then we transfer them into other spaces. And so we have to understand how unconscious bias do impact. So when we center in the idea of unconscious bias, I want you first to center the idea that these are what we call unconscious bias, right? They happen so automatically, we don't even give them to thought. But we have to be more deliberate and intentional when we think about our biases, because every single time these biases, they do impact people. And I know somebody has said, when we talk about unconscious bias, what happens when we deliberately have a bias? Well, that is not unconscious, that is explicit, right? And that is a whole different topic. And I think that is why we see what's happening around us even now in 2020, the protests and the resistance and the anti-black racism and the indigenous work that we are trying to do to unpack and dismantle and disrupt, because those are intentional, explicit bias of homophobia and sexism and racism and ageism and anti-black racism and all the different things that we do. But that is not our focus. That is not our focus. Our focus is to think about the unconscious biases that we hold and how they impact others, and how we can ensure that we will make that less, right? So think about the biases we hold against, whether somebody's male or female, or somebody doesn't identify, non-binary. persons who are on the LGBTQ spectrum, 2S LGBTQ plus spectrum, and how we see people. And I always like to pause to say to people, think about think about how you think about others, how we value others. Sometimes you don't realize that the unconscious bias you hold is exactly what impacts your decision making process. Who is valued, who is not valued, who gets to be included, who gets to be excluded, who is given access. Those things are many times implicated, or they're impacted by our influence, by our unconscious biases. And so that is why we have to ensure that we unpack them, because if we don't unpack them, as you see, they are continually impacting others and they impact our work, right? And so we act on them. If we do not attend to them, they will continue to hurt or harm. So, a foundational definition, and the link is there. Also, I provided the link, and I will provide the link with your professor if needs be. But many of you have different um, 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 definitions. So for me, one of my definitions that I use is commonly defined as a prejudice or unsupported judgment in favor of or against one thing, person, or group as compared to another in many ways that is usually considered unfair. And that is why we want to attend to them, because most time our unconscious bias is in favor of, it's an unfair disadvantage. Many researchers suggest that unconscious bias occurs automatically as the brain makes quick judgments. We talked about that before, based on past experiences and background. So that past experience, we also call that the schema and your background. And so sometimes you wonder why you make certain judgment. It's because of your background and your past experiences, and those kind of um, 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 schema is embedded into your brain. And when you see something, you immediately quickly make a judgment. And all of us have unconscious biases. Let me make that very clear. All of us, we carry unconscious biases. The good news is that many of us, we are more aware of those biases, and we have attended to them to lessen the hurt or the harm that we can cause. And so a course like this is for you to unpack those unconscious biases, right? To unpack them, to attend to them. And I'm going to give you some tips at the end of this about how to do that quickly. As a result of unconscious bias, certain people benefit and other persons are penalized. And another definition that I like is also unconscious bias are social stereotypes about certain groups of people that individuals form outside of their own conscious awareness. Everyone holds unconscious beliefs about various social and identity groups. And these biases stem from one's tendency to organize social worlds by categorizing. Black people always, gay men, lesbian women do, single mothers do, those persons who live in those kind of apartments, they do, immigrants do, Muslim women do, Muslim men do, Jewish people do, and we continue with that. And we make those stereotypes, those assumptions, and of course, I don't have to just say much about that. You understand the implications for that, and you understand how that can impact, marginalize, continue to minorize, affect people, demonize. That's another word that it that's to we allow those unconscious bias to do that work. So we have to catch them. We have to catch them. We talk about this already. We talk about explicit bias. They are expressed. They are expressed directly. We are aware of those biases. We operate consciously. An explicit bias is like, I like white. I like white more than Latino, right? An explicit bias. An unconscious implicit bias, they are expressed indirectly, but they are powerful. I want to underline that. Yes, they are indirect. Yes, they are unconscious, but we continue to do them. They do impact others. Unaware of the bias. That's why we have to bring them forward, shine a light on them so we can know what we're doing and how we're acting. Operate subconsciously. An example would be sitting further away from a Latina than a white individual. And why? And we do that. You know, one of the activities that just come to me, I wasn't planning on sharing this, but one of the activities that comes to me, I always say to my students, especially if you're in Toronto, you enter a subway and there are tons of empty seats. Immediately, there, I mean, in less than a split of a second, your unconscious bias always in operation, and you determine who you want to sit beside or who you don't want to sit beside. And you may say, "Really? No, I just always sit there." No, you don't. Think about it. Think about the persons. If you had to sit beside 10 different people on an empty subway car, think about the persons you do not sit beside and the reason why. It's sometimes unconsciously we do that. That is why sometimes, some people will say to you, it doesn't happen and it's not true. But black people and many black men will tell you, you go on a place and you sit a certain seat, people pull their bag close to them because immediately you think, I'm going to steal, I'm going to rob from you. Immediately you go there because the kind of image you have of a black person, of the black man, is that what he's going to do is going to either hurt, harm, steal, kill, that kind of stuff, right? And so he's aggressive, right? So he's less than, he's going to pick your pocket, he's going to steal your purse. And so we react to those things. And in other circumstances, in larger organizations and in larger systems, react to them, and people are always disenfranchised. And that is why I tell people all the while, you have to work on this because someone is being disenfranchised when you continue to operate with those unconscious bias. So, who is most impacted by our unconscious bias? And it deals with a lot of categories of class and gender, sexual orientation, education level. We said it's already: immigration status, race, ethnicity, accent, skin color, race, but colorism is another part of that. So many things, headdress, all those things come into play. If you do, Jana Freeman, in a beautiful article, talks about, if you do not know what biases you harbor, you are powerless against them, and you may be harming others unintentionally. In this case, ignorance is not bliss. Ignorance is a privilege. And that is why learning is a change in behavior brought about by an experience. When you come to a course like this and a learning experience like this, you unpack those biases and you change your behavior. I always say to people, it makes no sense you go to workshop after workshop, course after course. You get an A plus, but you're still the same person. When I went to teachers college way back. I remember one of the first definition I learned about what is learning, and the definition was a change in behavior brought about by an experience. That's how my lecturer back in 1990s, the early 1990s, defined learning: a change in behavior brought about by an experience. So we have to think about it. We harbor those biases. I've always said this. I said I have never had a neighbor. I wasn't brought up with Muslim neighbors and Muslim friends and Muslim schoolmates. Never. But I was living in America, teaching in America for a short time when 9/11 happened. And immediately all of us, like automatically, was wired to be scared of anybody who was a Muslim or who wore hijab. You go to the airport and immediately your body got tense. And if you see someone with hijab wearing person, we were wired like that. You have to understand why you react to certain things a certain way. Why you think that person is going to do this. Why? Because we are being wired with so many, um, not unconscious bias at this point, but explicit bias against a group of person that has disenfranchised them and pushed them aside to the edges and pushed them even over the edges. And we have to learn how to unpack that, unlearn that, unwire ourselves. We have to learn how to unwire ourselves when it comes to that, those kind of things. So, you know, the same article, Jane and Freeman 2016, says if we do not overcome our biases, we can inadvertently harm relationships and alienate people with our thoughtless autopilot response. And collectively, these individual biases create disparate outcomes in our institutions. So your bias and our bias and all these things happen, and we understand why systematic assumptions and systematic oppressive practices and systematic racism and institutions have become biased because we don't attend to them. We don't attend to them. We do not attend to them. So we have to attend to them. And I love this statement actually, this quote from Vora 2018. At work, biases or the perception of bias is the biggest contributor to people disengagement, and cost of disengagement is huge. I want you to think about that for a minute. How many times you have felt that you may have felt marginalized or chastised or something, and you just be like, you know what, let me not be involved. You disengage. You disengage. And the cost of disengagement is extremely high. And so we have to attend to these things. I'm going to show you a quick case study I use. A case study, a grade 4 student of South Asian descent who attended an inner city school, was interested in sports and wanted to practice with the girls' school basketball team. The gym teacher told her, "You are better off at home, as I know that your family is not going to allow you to play basketball. They prefer that you girls help out at home so you will marry at a young age." There are levels of unconscious bias, but I also think, and I think some of you will also think, there are levels of explicit conscious bias in that case study. But I shared it as you to think about quickly. What are the issues you see here? And I just want you to let you know how you see the issues also is an implication or an idea of who you are and the space you see from, because not all of us will see this from different angles. And that's why it's so important that we get to understand who we are. It's important when you do the kind of work that you are going to do, you must understand who you are as a person, because your ideas, your perceptions, your unconscious bias, your learning, your thought process is influenced totally by who you are. You can't think like me if you don't come from my experience, or you haven't if you're totally shut out from an experience like I am as a Black Caribbean man, immigrant. You have to think about what has shaped my ideas. And so even a case like this, as a student, I want you to think about, how do you approach this? What are the issues you see? And when you discuss this later on, what are the issues you didn't see? And think about, why did you not see that? How will this impact the individual? What happens when this kind of thinking is embedded in our daily practices? And a very big one I like to ask: were you able to relate to this case? Why or why not? Think about that for a minute. Think about that for a minute. What happens when this kind of thinking is embedded in our daily practice and way of thinking? I want you to take another 10 seconds to think, what happens when this kind of thinking is embedded in our daily practice and way of thinking? And that is why I put the sign "Stop Bias," because it impacts us. So here comes the good news, everybody. Ready for the good news? Unconscious biases are not permanent. That's the good news. In fact, they are malleable. You can move them. You can work on them. You can work to unpack and to break down and to dismantle and to delete and to take away. And steps can be taken to limit their impact on our thoughts and on our thoughts, and our behaviors. See my pain in my ears? That's my allergies. So, dealing with your unconscious bias, let's wrap this up. How do we deal with our unconscious biases? Education and awareness. That's why you're here. Ask questions. Less assumptions, more questions. especially think about gender and diversity, and about when they talk about gender and sexual orientation and all that kind of stuff and sexuality, we talk about spectrum. We talk about preferred pronoun. We talk about how do you identify. We talk about what a man can do, what a man cannot do, what a woman should do, what a woman should not do. We talk about non-binary. We have to be more, we have to be better at asking questions and weigh and make way less assumptions. Develop safe and break spaces to discuss unconscious bias. And I'm going to literally say something here. I rather you develop brave spaces because we like to make assumptions about safe spaces. This is something I don't do very well, talking about safe space, because I like to say safe for who? And you are the kind of person in counseling doing this kind of work. Safe for who? I think there was a time when everyone was so big on using the terminology safe space. We were major on the safe space, I would say the safe space trade, until we start to realize that what was safe for John was not safe for Johnny. What was safe for Peter was not safe for Paul. And sometimes we force people into these safe spaces. Let us talk. I have seen this actually in practice where persons are damaged in quote unquote safe spaces. So I don't really do safe spaces too much. That's personal opinion. I do brave spaces. And that is why I always tell people a lot of our conversation needs to happen, but they need brave spaces. Challenge assumptions and traditions. Look for the contrary. If you think this, but your actions say this, you say you think this, but your actions demonstrate this, that's contrary. Look for that. Look for that. Your bias is at work. Look for patterns. Every time you see a particular person, this is your reaction. Every time you see a particular kind of news story about a group, this is your reaction. Look for the patterns and ask yourself questions. Why am I reacting like this? A lot of persons who have done homophobic, racist, things, you know, any other of those isms and ageism and sizeism and colorism. Those of us those persons who end up getting themselves in a mess with those kind of assumptions and stereotypes, we need to take a step back before people, when somebody call you out, before you become offensive or defensive and offensive. Absolutely. Because before you become defensive and offensive, pull back and ask yourself, why was it necessary for me to say that? Why did I use that? Why did I react the way I reacted? Attend to data and evidences. Facts are facts. Let's attend to those. What is the data saying about what we do? Separate your facts from your feelings. Communicate clearly. Tell your story and listen to the story of others. That's how you get to know people. That's how you get to know people. Tell your stories and listen to the stories of others. Avoid stereotypes and overgeneralizations. We already said that. Embrace diversity. So you have to embrace diversity. You have to be able to be genuine, to be real genuine about breaking down and dismantling unconscious bias. You have to embrace diversity and difference. You have to realize that someone is different from you, and there are many ways that we are created, many ways of levels and layers to us as human beings. And you have to learn how to embrace. I didn't say tolerate, embrace. Because if you tolerate difference and tolerate diversity, then you are still where you are initially. Because that tolerance, so to speak, at one point again, we had this thing about tolerance. Nobody wants to be tolerated. People want to be respected. I wouldn't even say loved, respected and valued. Have a diverse group of people around the decision making table. Many organizations, this is where they fail. Many organizations, this is where they fail. I'm not sure if you have ever gone to any interviews like myself. Everybody on that side of the table is white. I've done interviews, 7 white people, 11 different, like everybody is the same. And you're on the other side. What chance you think you may be getting that job when you're old, when everybody thinks alike, and when they ask you a question, your response sometimes is so different, and they want your response to be exactly like theirs. We don't all come from the same space, and I always call on HR people to think about that, where they have certain desired response. It comes from a certain philosophy, a certain idea, a certain background of thinking. Get your communities, your groups to be more diverse so you can understand difference and get a good richness. That's my word, a richness of ideas. Engage in self reflection. Actually, that should have been in red because self reflection is key. Question yourself, interrogate. Why am I doing this? Why do I say this? Why did I react like this? Be an active ally. You know the persons who are disenfranchised. You know who doesn't have access and doesn't have a voice. You know who is being left out of the conversation. Be that an active ally. We have had a lot going on in the last couple months. And what we have is everybody wants a talk. Everybody wants to say, I see you. How are you feeling? But nobody wants to act. Allyship is about action. And stop calling yourself an ally if you have not acted. Stop calling yourself an ally if you have not acted. And practice empathy. One of the major skill to be inclusive. To be inclusive is that practice of empathy. Too many of us don't understand what empathy is. Empathy is an entire course by itself. I teach a course that deals with empathy as an entire unit by itself, a master's level leadership course. Empathy is an entire unit by itself because somebody realized that's what we're lacking. And I said to you before, you have to unlearn. A lot of what it's so funny. The more I talk about this a lot in my work and my workshops. The more we go to school for learning, the more we realize we need to unlearn. What are the things you learn about First Nations people? What are those things you learn about immigrant people? What are those things you learn about women that they can or cannot do? What are those things you learn about women and their place? What are those things you learn you learn about black men and gay men and Christian and Muslim and Hindu and atheist? Like, what are the things you learn? So some of those things we have to unlearn and unwire ourselves. And unwiring is different from unlearning because unwiring is to unwrap yourself. We are so wrapped up in certain things. We have to unwire ourselves. So that's some of my resources. That article you can you can always Google those resources. And you have other resources, but I want to share that with you. And you can always follow me on my Instagram to learn more about all the stuff I do when it comes to this kind of stuff. I post things on unconscious bias quite a bit. Thank you so much for having me as your guest speaker, your guest presenter in your class. I'm sure it would have been amazing if we were live together, but that's a part of our learning process as individuals that we have to rise to the occasion of virtual learning and how to make the best of it. And I hope and trust that you got something from this conversation today about uncovering and dealing with unconscious bias. It's about us. It's about the work that needs to be done within us and by us. It's not about the person over there. It's about us. How do we uncover and deal with our unconscious biases? We all have them. We can make them less. We can impact the world in positive ways if we attend to them. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much.